request by a member of the public that the council consider adopting a resolution. I'll paraphrase what I understand the request to be somewhat along the lines of a resolution that would declare support for the proposition that corporations are not people under the Constitution and do not have the same rights as natural persons. As a consequence of that request, a couple council members asked for some background information about the relevant U.S. Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, and I've prepared and circulated to the council a short summary and a little bit of context for that decision. And I'll just very quickly hit the highlights of what I provided to you. This is a Supreme Court decision that was decided in January of 2010. It was a 5-4 decision. The case arose out of circumstances where a nonprofit corporation by the name of Citizens United had prepared and had produced and or was preparing to release a film in 2008 during the presidential campaign that was very critical of Hillary Clinton. And anticipating that the film might be released and on television and on cable on demand immediately prior to the primary or general election, and that might be a violation of federal law, Citizens United took the proactive approach of going into court and asking the judge to declare that the appropriate statute was unconstitutional, and eventually that case made its way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the case, the specific issue that the U.S. Supreme Court was asked to rule on was whether certain provisions, not the entire statute, but just certain provisions of what is often referred to as the campaign finance law, which at the time prohibited corporations and labor unions from using general treasury funds to make contributions or expenditures in connection with any election to a political office within 30 days of the primary election or 60 days of the general election. And this film was the kind of communication and expenditure that would have been captured by the federal statute. And the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that those provisions of the statute were unconstitutional as they applied to Citizens United, and essentially the court held that the federal government cannot suppress political speech based on the speaker's identity, whether it's a corporation or whether it's an individual. And then sort of the next level of detail, the court found that the test that they normally use in these kinds of political speech cases, and that often have been used to find that a corporation was somewhat restricted in its political speech. In this case, this majority of 5 justices found that test did not support restricted political speech. And so the outcome of that is what you may have all seen in the newspapers referred to as the super PACs and the influence that that has had, particularly on the Republican primary so far. But essentially today, based on this Citizens United decision, individuals, corporations, labor unions can contribute as much money as they want to these PACs that are set up that can then use the money to support the candidate. They're prohibited from coordinating those efforts with the campaign itself, but as many of you may have read, what has turned out is that, especially in a number of key primary states, these PACs are spending 5, 6, 7 times as much money on advertising as the campaign itself. And none of that could have happened prior to Citizens United. So there's no question it's had an impact on the political process. What I think is also true, and I tried to provide some context for you, is that the notion of corporations having rights has been around for over 100 years. Now, it wasn't true for the first 100 years, and there are still many people, and I think some people here in the room today, that would subscribe philosophy that the Supreme Court had for the first 100 years that we were a country. And there was a famous case where the Supreme Court wrote that a corporation is an artificial being, invisible, intangible, and existing only in contemplation of law. Being a mere creature of the law, it possesses only those properties which the charter of its creation confers upon it. And so for the first 100 years, corporations were found not to have certain rights that people have. And that is still the view of the four Supreme Court justices, but obviously not the majority. But over 100 years ago, the court started changing its view, and today corporations are recognized to have certain free speech rights under the First Amendment. They're protected from unreasonable search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. They're free from double jeopardy under the Fifth Amendment. They have a right to counsel under the Sixth Amendment. They have a right to jury trials. Like natural persons, they can own property, they pay taxes, they can sue or be sued. So Citizens United, definitely the court moved the ball in concluding that corporations have greater political speech rights than had previously been understood to be the case. But it's also reasonable to view that decision in the context of over 100 years of jurisprudence, that rightly or wrongly, but it's a fact that the Supreme Court has regularly found corporations have certain rights. And I guess I don't have anything more to say about it than other than that. I can answer any questions, try and answer any questions that this little constitutional law seminar might have given rise to. And then finally, I would just note that there are members of the public here who feel passionately about this issue. They are aware that it is that work study sessions typically do not have a place for public comment, but I have a feeling they have requested an opportunity to make brief and concise comments, but they understand that's totally within the council's discretion.
Can you go back to the facts? It sounds like the first action was in 2008.
Yeah.
And I guess they showed the film and then they did what?
I don't know that they did show the film, actually. But either way, they knew that they were running afoul of the statute, and so they deliberately went, they didn't wait for the FEC to sue them and say you violated our statute. They went to court and said, we want to do this, and this statute is unconstitutional. It needs to be struck down so that we can do what we want to do.
I was just curious, but it sounded like the court ruling didn't happen until 2 years later.
That's correct. Welcome to American justice. Yeah.
So it had no effect on that 2008.
Correct. Yeah. They were fighting they were taking it was a battle and a longer war. They recognized that.
Greg, I have a question in regards to this, considering the corporation as an entity. We're talking about it here in particular as it relates to political campaigns and freedom of speech, but aren't there a lot of other issues related to a corporation that, from what little knowledge I have of corporation, the reason people go into corporations is that it creates a separate entity. It does provide some level of liability protection to the stockholders, if you will, or the owners of the corporation. And by changing that concept of a corporation not being a legal entity, does that also affect those protections?
It does not.
It would not.
Correct.
So in regards to the request that we have here tonight, if we were to support something like that, it would jeopardize the rest of the issues related to the corporation.
Right. And in fact, I suppose one argument is that those more traditional concepts of corporations, such as protecting shareholders from liability, are what corporations should do, and they shouldn't be out there in the marketplace, political marketplace, acting like regular persons. But it would not. The answer to your question is supporting a resolution that says corporations
are the remedies? Number one, we all understand it would be an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And is there a remedy that says a future Supreme Court can reverse the decision? That's the second question. And the third was related to the request we've had from some people in the public that we pass a resolution requesting an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And I'd like to know what's our legal parameters for doing anything like that.
Well, I'll start with that.
Three questions.
Yeah, so I'll start with the last question because, I mean, as I think everyone appreciates on the council, any resolution of that nature would be advisory only. It would indicate a certain level of support, perhaps for a grassroots effort that is trying to get started here in the state that might eventually lead to a similar resolution being adopted someday at the state legislature and state legislatures all over the country slowly building support in Congress to do something. And so going now to your first question, yes, I mean, any action to amend the Constitution or to try and pass new laws that would pass constitutional muster, either that's going to happen in Congress or it's going to happen through some kind of constitutional convention that amends the Constitution. Pretty tough things to do these days. And I kind of lost track of your second. There's a second question in there.
Supreme Court.
Oh,
Future Supreme
sure.
Court.
Well, I mean, this one, as I think people appreciate, elections matter because the president ends up appointing Supreme Court justices frequently that long outlive the president's administration. So, could a future Supreme Court interpret this differently? Yes, absolutely. I think you see one of the reasons some people were very disappointed with Citizens United was because there's a string of cases that the court could have continued to follow that would have said corporations don't have exactly the same rights as natural persons. There are limits. We're not going to allow them to contribute to these super PACs unlimited money. And it's worth mentioning, as I mentioned in the memo, that prior to Citizens United, corporations and unions could contribute money towards issues only. They couldn't advocate for a candidate, but they could support issues. And this case goes a step further. So, if there was if there was just one different person on the Supreme Court, this case easily could have gone a different way, and that could still happen.
Mr. Bender, I'd like for the council to speak on whether they want to allow the members of the public to speak.
Well, I was going to broach that subject after everybody had a chance here on the council to speak. Frank, did you indicate you wanted to say something?
I was going to ask council the same thing, if it was going to be tonight or if we wanted to have a public hearing that we announced in advance.
Then maybe,
Do you guys have a preference if it's tonight or another time?
You can show up, I'd like to hear what they have to say, but I would ask that if they could, when they introduce themselves, if you could let me know, are you a resident of the city of Port Arthur or not?
Or can we get your address, actually? Because everyone thinks they live in Port Arthur.
That's why I said the city. To be specific.
yes, is the rest of the council? I would like to ask that,
Within limits as far as time?
yes, I was going to say, I'd like to add that we limit it to, say, no more than 3 minutes, and that you don't try to go plow the same ground twice if somebody else says something to you, that you agree with, and you say, I agree with that person, and you don't say it in another way, so we can move the meeting along. But let's see if everybody can follow those rules, and I don't see it.
I suggest that if you're just gonna say the same thing that somebody else said, that maybe you could just wait your time and so we could get new, refreshing comments rather than listening to the same thing.
Okay, so, anyone wishing to speak, raise your hand.
Who wants to go first? All right. Thank you for taking time to consider this issue. My name is Aaron Smith. I'm a former resident of Port Orchard and a lifelong resident of Kitsap County. A resolution denouncing the capricious Citizens United's decision is the right choice. While the decision may have been justified in case law, its blatant disregard for the humanity is anything but justified. Corporations are singularly motivated by profit. While profits are a good thing, they should not be one's sole purpose. Rising profits to such levels has a cruel and heartless history, a history full of environmental and human disasters, a history that highlights the worst of human emotions. A human being has many motivations. Humans are motivated by community, by family, by spirituality, by feelings, thoughts, actions of others. These many and varied motivations inform our political lives. Corporations do not know the meaning of these various motivations. If we truly want a society based on egalitarian, Jeffersonian ideals, the profit motive must not be elevated above all other motivations. Corporations are singularly motivated and should not have undue political influence. The Supreme Court decision gives corporations undue political influence. Corporations can now give unlimited and anonymous to political action committees because of this decision. This is a grave and imminent threat to our beloved democracy. Our democracy is based on citizens' human involvement, not the protection of corporations' singular profit motive. As a historian, I'm certain that our founding fathers did not intend for our Bill of Rights to apply to corporations. Join many other small jurisdictions that have taken a stand against this dangerous Supreme Court decision. While such a resolution would be non-binding, it would show wisdom of this legislative body, and it would send a clear message that corporations will not influence Port Orchard unduly. There are many ongoing efforts to amend the U.S. Constitution to once and for all declare that only humans are humans, and that rights and protections of the Constitution only protect living, breathing humans. Be on the right side of this important issue. Pass a resolution that opposes the arbitrary Citizens United ruling. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Don Manning, and I live in Port Orchard, and I've said a lot in here on this. And I know there's been some emails sent to all of you that touch on some of the points of this, and I appreciate the work that the city attorney did in the history of what's going on with corporations and our democracy. I would point out, though, that the very first initial injection of corporations into our Constitution was not passed by the Supreme Court. It was kind of a stealth move by railroad corporations back in the 1800s, and it somehow stuck into the court record, and that's easily verifiable. You can research that. And there's been several rulings since then that have kind of stair-stepped up to the point of where we're at now, which is basically whoever has the biggest paycheck is going to probably win or get their man elected, whether that money comes from donors in the United States, the money from a United States corporation or a foreign corporation, because it's anonymous as long as it's done through these so-called PACs. About 4 years before the election, a professor, a scholar and professor at the University of British Columbia, Joel Bakken, I believe his name is, or Bacon, he wrote a book called The Corporation, The Pathological Pursuit of Profit and Power. This was in 2004, so it was 4 years before the presidential election. And in his book, he said something to the effect that the corporation's legally defined mandate is to pursue relentlessly and without exception its own self-interest, regardless of the often harmful consequences it might cause to others. None of us as citizens who are part of a larger community can act with such unrestrained self-interest. And he also argued that if anyone was singularly self-interested, if they constantly tried to manipulate everything, if they acted grandiose and displayed a lack of empathy and had antisocial tendencies, they'd probably be diagnosed as psychopathic. And that pretty much describes a lot of the functioning of corporations. As you know, many things that have happened in the past, let's say the BP oil spill, pretty much they refused to accept responsibility of that. They showed they're unable to feel remorse, and they have a problem to relate with others except superficially. Corporations are not people. The Constitution was not written for corporations. It was written for flesh and blood citizens. Corporations are to have charters. Those charters are revocable if they're not operating in the good of the public. And to just give them more and more rights to the point of being actually protected by our own Constitution, in my mind, is just ridiculous.
Hello, my name is Chris Henry. I'm a resident of Bremerton. Might seem off subject, but I'd like to give you a bigger picture of my view of things. Did you know that the state of Washington in 2010, through Senate Joint Memorial 8027, stated to the U.S. President and Congress that the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was designed to protect the free speech of people, not corporations. I didn't hear much about that, but I researched and I found that resolution. The letter goes on to say that the Supreme Court's ruling in Citizens United versus FTC presents a serious and direct threat to our democracy. But again, it went to Washington, where there's a vacuum, and a media where the interests of people are not heard. Only big money interests are heard. Did you know that in 2009, the Quadrennial Defense Report by the Department of Defense stated, and I quote, "Climate change will contribute to food and water scarcity, will increase the spread of disease, and may spur or exacerbate mass migration." Did you know this? The report goes on to say, although the United States has significant capacity to adapt to climate change, it will pose challenges for civil society and DoD alike. There is a vacuum in Washington and our media where the interests of true national defense are lost only to the interests of big money. Again, the largest profitable corporation is Exxon, and their profits depend on our continued dependence on oil. Again, we don't hear that our own Department of Defense, our largest funded, taxpayer-funded source, is saying climate change is real and we need to act. Again, did you know that the United Nations report in 2011 stated, and I quote, "Small farmers can double food production within 10 years in critical regions by using ecological methods. And conventional farming relies on expensive inputs, fuels climate change, and is not resilient to climate shocks." You might not have heard this either. There's very little money to be made on small-scale farms. The report goes on to say that private companies will not invest time and money in practices that cannot be rewarded by patents and which don't open markets for chemical products or improved seeds. Again, there's a vacuum on these ideas because they don't rely on corporate interests. So what I'm asking is that there's pressing issues in humanity and our nation that cannot and will not be addressed in our current political climate where corporate interests are held higher than human interests. So my prayer is that city by city, we can build awareness to this issue and encourage our state legislators to have a constitutional convention to create an amendment stating that corporations are not people. It's got to come from the bottom up. It's got to come from the state. And I know it's historical precedence to have the states come together, but relying on our Congress to do it, I think, is hopeless. So I'm really looking for your help to do this. And one added fact that when it was proposed to have an income tax in the state of Washington for the top 2%, that would have opened the door to have a corporate tax in Washington. Because there is no income tax in the state of Washington, there cannot be a corporate tax under the idea that corporations are people. So you might want to consider opening that door.
My name is Tim Kelly. I don't actually live in the city limits, but up until a couple of weeks ago, I was editor of the Portage Independent. That was a job I thoroughly enjoyed, but the new out-of-town publisher that took over decided he did not want me to be the editor anymore. But I'm pleased to tell you tonight that I'll soon be starting a new job as editor of the Kitsap Peninsula Business Journal. And my duties there will include observing and reporting on, and I'm happy to say writing editorials about local governments and the actions of elected officials. But I'm here tonight because I want to talk to you about this request that my friend Don Manning has submitted. And I urge you to pass a resolution that will take a stand against Citizens United because it's having a very negative effect on our supposedly democratic election process in this country. In fact, I believe the effect it's having is contributing to a subversion of the democratic process, which is supposed to manifest the will of the people, but it instead is being bent more and more to the will of these wealthy and powerful corporations who don't always have the best interests, or rarely have the best interests of the average citizens in mind. And even if they did, I don't think it's a good idea for sustaining and strengthening our democracy to allow corporations, including ones that have foreign investors, to spend tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars, as they're doing, to influence our elections. This unrestricted corporate money goes to supposedly independent groups that do little else besides producing negative attack ads that tear down candidates who are not the preferred candidates of these corporations. Fresh in our minds is the negative and controversial tactics in an election right here in Port Orchard last fall. And think about this. If the group behind that negative campaign had enlisted the backing of corporations that shared their political agenda, we could have seen unrestricted corporate money pour in to finance all the attack ads that group or any other group wanted to run. Now, a few weeks ago, I was present for part of the retreat the council held, and I was there when you had a discussion about ethics and integrity, and it was clear that you value the ethics and integrity of each of your members, and that you trust the integrity and ethics of each other, and that's a wonderful thing. So I think passing a resolution taking a stand against this very misguided ruling that is having a harmful effect on our democratic processes is the right thing to do, and I hope that's what you will do when you consider this. Thank you.
My name is Dick Davis. I'm a resident of Port Orchard. I'm also a 45-year veteran of the private sector. And I listen to the bashing of corporations, and yes, anybody can find a corporation someplace, somewhere, who has done some harm to the public. But as a matter of fact, corporations do great things as well. And limiting corporations from being involved in the political process in this day and age, when regulation is a favorite tactic of administrations, of legislative bodies to control, to attempt to restrict corporations from doing the good work that they do, and most of them do good work, I think is far-sighted and ill-advised. And I look around and I have a feeling that among this whole group here, I may be the only person who has spent his lifetime working in the private sector and understanding exactly how the private sector works. It is not a demon who sits around figuring how it can screw the public. That's not their nature. Their nature is to make a profit, no doubt about it. Each of us who has a 401k or owns some stock, we're all beneficiaries of what they do. And let's not lose sight of the good things that they do and the positive aspects that they bring to our communities. Thank you.
Thank you again for considering this issue. Christensen. I'm a resident of Bremerton, so perhaps in this context, you might consider me out-of-state PAC money that's come into your community. The difference is that as I speak here, I'm accountable for my words. You know who I am, and now you know where I came from. I would just emphasize, to follow up on what others have said, that one of the biggest problems, in my opinion, of Citizens United is the lack of transparency. There's just no way to trace the money, to know who is promoting something, to know who is behind an initiative or a candidate, whether it's a political candidate, a ballot initiative, a judicial candidate. And those are all very, very serious concerns that all of us have. And I think democracy is that we are accountable for what we say, for what we stand behind and represent. And because of the way that money can go to one 501c, which is not anonymous, and then be transferred to another that is, the money then goes to political candidates, it's a completely opaque process. So I would not be able to, not have to stand here, give you my name, where I came from, and what I represent in this process. It's completely under the radar and completely non-transparent. Thank you.
I'm not going to use it. Brian Petro, hometown troublemaker, instigator, and Brian.
Brian,
You have to
because behind you we can't.
You can't hear
They're
me?
taping it. Yeah,
Oh, they're taping it.
You're on camera.
Well,
You'll love it.
I want to tell you some history. The founders of our state wanted to get away from corporations owning the political system. As a matter of fact, at the first legislature of when we became a state, the railroads were trying to get some special favors from the legislature. And so they offered to buy the legislature all the booze you could drink at the legislature back then. And so they all had a good time, and they voted on on what the railroads wanted, and they voted against the railroads. And at the end of the legislature, they stood up, here's the receipt for the booze, we need to be reimbursed. The people who came out to the Northwest wanted to get away from them having all the money and controlling the political system, including the founding fathers of our city. The problem is that the big money, and it's not the mom and pop corporation or our local Boeing company, it's the companies from outside of our country that are buying our political system. Let's just bring it down to a local level. Let's say some international company bought Safe Boats, and they wanted you to redo the boat launch, and they wanted